Donald's complete destruction of the east wing of the White House to make room for his gaudy, obscenely expensive ballroom, after he promised he would not disturb the pre existing buildings there, reminds me a little bit of some family history. In February 1965, my grandfather, Fred, acquired the site of Steeplechase Park, one of three iconic amusement parks in Coney Island that had been in operation since around the turn of the 20th century. Steeplechase had outlived its two rivals by decades. Dreamland had been destroyed by a fire in 1911, and Luna Park, also struck by fires, had closed in 1944. Now, my grandfather owned a building complex and a shopping area nearby named after Luna Park. Steeplechase, however, as a park, continued operations until 1964. The Tillieu family had owned the park from the beginning, but several factors, including high crime in the area, increasing competition for entertainment dollars, had persuaded them finally to sell the property. Fred, who had known that Steeplechase might become available for development, set his sights on its acquisition. The plan would be yet another residential development in Brooklyn in the style of Trump Village, but a significant hurdle would need to be overcome. Current zoning laws from public use to private construction would have to be changed. So while my grandfather waited for the opportunity to present himself, he began to lobby his old cronies for their support, and he began drafting his proposal. Here's the thing though, by the mid 60s, my grandfather's biggest projects and most lucrative projects were behind him. So he was losing sway. He didn't have nearly as much clout as he once had. So, knowing that perhaps this project was not going to go smoothly, he dangled the possibility of my dad's becoming involved in what would be a potentially ambitious project if it went well, or could make him the face of the project if it failed. Now, my dad had been essentially sidelined from the family business for various reasons, including that for about a year he quit to go be a pilot for TWA, which at the dawn of the jet age you would consider was a big deal, but that my grandfather would never forgive him for. My dad was, as the oldest son and namesake, and presumably heir to the empire, was frantic to prove himself to his father, despite the fact that was practically impossible at the time. So he jumped at the opportunity, suspecting that it might indeed be his last chance to prove himself to what everybody called my grandfather the old man. By then, my mom was already 6 months pregnant with me. My grandfather completed the purchase of Steeplechase Park for $2.5 million in July of 65, a couple of months after I was born. And a year later, Trump management was still struggling to get the approvals and zoning it needed to move ahead. They were also battling public opposition to the project. By the time the summer was over, my grandfather's plans for Steeplechase were in peril, and he knew it. Fred had been counting on his longtime connections to the Brooklyn Democratic machine, which had, again, in the past, eased the way for so many of his developments while securing him hundreds of millions of dollars in government financing. By the 1960s, again, as I said, a lot of those cronies were not just falling out of power, they weren't that interested in helping Fred Trump anymore. So it became clear he was not going to get the rezoning he needed. Nevertheless, he continued to make my dad, Freddie, responsible for the near impossible, making Steeplechase a success. In fact, whether it was implicit or explicit, it was made known to my dad that he didn't have a choice in the matter. But time was running out. Suddenly, my dad, at 28 years old, had a more public role, giving press conferences and arranging photo ops. In this picture, my dad stands in the foreground of a warehouse that's empty and cavernous, staring into the vast space, looking small and utterly lost, which I believe is what he was at the time. But before we go on, we have to protect our democracy. So please like and share this video. And if you believe in our mission, please subscribe to the Mary Trump Media channel. In a last-ditch effort to circumvent a push by local residents to have Steeplechase declared a landmark, which would have obviated any possibility for a residential development, Fred decided to host an event at the Pavilion of Fun, which was built in 1907. The purpose of this event was to celebrate the park's demolition. In other words, my grandfather was planning to destroy what the community was trying to save before landmark status could be secured. He had my dad give a press conference in order to announce the plan, thereby making him the face of the controversy. The extravaganza featured models in bathing suits, and guests were invited to throw bricks, available for purchase, of course, because we're talking about Fred Trump here, through the iconic window, which featured an enormous image of the park's mascot, Tilly, and his wide, toothy smile. In a photograph, my grandfather holds a sledgehammer while grinning at bikini clad women. Here's that picture. The entire spectacle was a disaster. Sentiment, nostalgia, and community were concepts my grandfather didn't understand. But when those windows were broken at his behest, even he must have realized that he himself had gone too far. Due to local rebellion against his project, he was unable to secure the zoning change he needed and was forced to back out of the Steeplechase development. The damage had been done, however. This whole venture exposed Fred's waning ability to move the ball down the field because his power for decades had largely derived from his connection. After this debacle, Fred would never again pursue an original construction project. Trump Village, which was completed in 1964, would be the last residential complex ever built by Trump management. Going forward, Fred and his other children, not including my dad, would make a considerable fortune turning rental properties into condos. Unable to accept responsibility, much as Donald later would be, Fred blamed his oldest son, Freddie, for the failure of Steeplechase, and my dad, being who he was, he blamed himself. As we all know, years later, the family trend continues. As the New York Times recently mentioned, quote, Donald has a long history of tearing things to the ground. In 1980, he kablammed the old Bonwood Teller building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan so he could raise up Trump Tower. He promised to preserve the treasured limestone friezes atop the old building, but then went and jackhammered them into oblivion. Oblivion. In a recent piece, the New York Times mentioned that Donald has a long history of tearing things down. In 1980, he raised the Bonwood Teller building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan so, quote, he could raise up Trump Tower. He promised to preserve the treasured limestone friezes atop the old building, but then went and jackhammered them into oblivion, infuriating the city's beau monde, unquote. Well, actually, he infuriated those of us who care about beauty. Those friezes were Art Deco masterpieces and had been promised to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But because it would have held up construction for a day or two and would have cost about $30,000, Donald went back on his useless promise and destroyed them. That's who he is. But at least we know he comes by it honestly, because that is exactly who my grandfather was. Nothing that stands in their way to get what they want is safe. The difference is that my grandfather's power finally faded when a new guard of politicians and power brokers emerged in the late 60s and early 70s. People who weren't afraid of him and people who didn't actually care about the clout that he used to have in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. Who's going to stop Donald? The corrupt, illegitimate Supreme Court? The feckless DOJ that is now entirely in his pocket and acts like his personal defense firm? Or the fascist Republican Party that, once again, continues to cede all of its constitutional power to prop up a petty tyrant while failing to do what they were elected to do, protect the interests of the American people against people like Donald. Please take a second and like and share this video. It'd be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please follow us and give the show a 5-star rating because it really does help other people find our content. Thanks.